All right, this will be a mini video lecture to catch up on some missed material on Africa, and we'll get into the Ottoman Empire as well. One thing that might be handy if you want to pause the video for a moment, I assume you're on a computer since you're watching this, and just pull up off of Google search a quick physical map of Africa so that you can see where it is we're talking about. And you can resume this video once you've got such a map pulled up. You may or may not want national boundaries on it. Doesn't matter, but I think a physical map showing the geographic zones might be a little more useful. Okay, once you have that, let's think first about Africa geographically and work around it clockwise, starting in the north up at the top. The northern coast of Africa, from Morocco to Egypt, had become part of the Islamic world back in the early Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries. Become thoroughly Islamicized, Egypt on the one end of it, and the area of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia on the other, which the Muslims called the Maghrib. They were, central zones with, very developed Islamic culture there. So we're not going to deal with that area really as a unit now. For purposes of a world history survey, we'll just count it as though it were an extension of the Middle East, effectively. Okay, south of that Mediterranean shore, right, you get the Sahara Desert. Very large, vast area, again, stretches almost from the furthest western extremes of Africa all the way across to Egypt and the Sudan, so nearly over to the to the Red Sea on the eastern side. Okay, now if you move, as we're saying, clockwise, let's go down that eastern side of Africa. To the south of Egypt, you have Ethiopia, up around the headwaters of the Nile River and sort of very mountainous and hilly area. Um, all through the Middle Ages and into the modern period, Ethiopia was an independent kingdom, kind of a hill kingdom. It was rather unique in that it was the only major Christian power, sort of isolated from the rest of the Christian world. But back in the days of the Roman Empire, Christianity had taken root in Ethiopia, grown there. You had the development of an Ethiopian church, closely identified with a monarchy there. And being up in the hills, as they were up in this mountainous territory, they maintained an independence from the surrounding powers, Muslim powers, and others neighboring them. The Ethiopians developed a very stratified society, almost a caste system, dominated by a landed warrior class, and had strong church institutions very, very closely tied in with the monarchy there. So, sort of the Christian identity of Ethiopia, very key. In the early modern period, they came into contact with the Portuguese as early as the 1480s and had periodic diplomatic contacts with the European world as well. Um, so that's Ethiopia. If you move over to the coast, down the eastern shore of Africa, facing the Indian Ocean, that's an area we call the Swahili coast. This runs from Somalia down the coastline through the shorelands of Uganda, Kenya, these kinds of areas. Well, I guess Uganda's inland, but Kenya and so forth, down to around modern Mozambique. Sort of all that Indian Ocean shore is called the Swahili coast, has its own dialect. This is an area where you get a number of coastal kingdoms, generally based around city-states, and they're an area that adopts Islam over the course of the Middle Ages because of being plugged into the Indian Ocean trade routes, right? The Indian Ocean is a very major thoroughfare, kind of connecting different parts of Africa and the Middle East and India and on into the Pacific world. And so that shoreline of Africa is very much integrated into the trade networks. And you get a number of kings there adopting Islam, brings in literacy, brings in trade connections thanks to the Islamic connection. And they tend to act as mediators for trade between the African hinterland and the merchants on the Indian Ocean. They're trading ivory, tortoiseshell, things like that, precious metals to some extent from inland and bringing them down to the shore, and then they're trading them to ships on the Indian Ocean. So the Swahili coast, significant area. As you sort of turn the corner and turn inland, you start looking at southern Africa. There's at least archaeological signs of some larger scale societies down there. On the whole, that area, though, really enters into the historical narrative and more connectivity with the rest of the world a bit later on, so I won't worry about it right now. It's largely a not very stratified or large scale society. There are some areas where archaeological remains indicate there must have been enough centralization to allow for some large-scale building projects, but most of it doesn't seem to have lasted all that long. Okay, moving now back around and up the western coast of Africa. In the center of Africa, you have the Congo region, a large rainforest area, and then you turn the corner to go out towards the western hump of Africa, so to speak, around Africa. And that's the area where we're really going to concentrate most of our attention. Between the Sahara Desert and the Atlantic Ocean in Western Africa, you get two major broad zones. Along the coast, you have an area which is more rainforest. Okay, more of a forested kind of an area. Whereas inland, you have grasslands as the rainforest gives way to sort of open plains, and then the open plains eventually get drier and drier and drier and transition into the Sahara Desert. You get rather different kinds of societies in those areas. Um, at the beginning of the early modern period in 1500, you have small local kingdoms in the rainforest area. Most of them are not very large. Most of them do not have very hierarchical societies. You do have chiefs or kings of at least a certain points along that coastline, but most of the coastal peoples are what we call segmentary societies. What that means, a segmentary society means that rather than social structure coming in a hierarchical fashion where you've got a peasantry and a merchant class and a nobility and royalty. Instead, what you have are clan groups or tribal groups acting kind of vertically. Okay, so you have, sort of rival clans, each of which has its own group of elders and its own sort of clan leadership or kinship-based leadership, sort of the heads of families, heads of the clans, heads of the extended families, on up to tribal heads, with kings kind of riding herd over the whole thing, but vertical class distinctions not being necessarily so significant. What's more significant are the horizontal rivalries from one class to another as they work that way. So sort of a different kind of social organization than what you might see in Europe or the Middle East or China or India or one of the other cultures we've been looking at, this sort of segmentary type of organization. You do have some institutions which work to cut across the segmentary boundaries. There are some blood brotherhood institutions, some secret societies, kind of clubs, which will bring in members from different clan groups or tribal groups. That kind of cuts across and allows um, for a stronger sense of cohesion across the community rather than these groups just being constantly at each other's throats and tearing each other apart. But that's sort of, a significant thing there. When you move inland from the coast and you get to the grassland areas, what you have there, from the Middle Ages onwards, from around the year 1000 or so, they first seem to emerge, and definitely through the remainder of the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, you have large-scale grassland empires. The older ones had been Mali and Ghana. Those are also the names of modern nations, but they had been large medieval kingdoms. In the early modern period after 1500, the main ones are Songhai, which is more in the westerly area around the Niger River, sort of with its capital at Timbuktu, on the one hand, and then Kanem Bornu, which is further inland, kind of around the area where modern Chad is. Okay, so Kanem Bornu and Songhai being the two really sort of large-scale major powers in Western Africa, ruling over much larger areas, much larger populations, not so segmentary as you have down in the coastland rainforest areas. Partly for environmental reasons, it's just easier to conquer and unite on a large scale in these inland grasslands compared to when you're moving from village to village through the rainforest. Um, the inland grassland empires are held together. They're sort of based on a sort of a tripod of factors, sort of multiple factors. One is especially in the Niger River area, especially for Songhai. This is an area where you have gold deposits being mined and being available, panning in the rivers and such. There's a lot of gold supply which is coming out of Songhai. You have a caravan trade setting out from Timbuktu and some of the other cities of Songhai, and to a lesser extent Kanem Bornu, crossing the Sahara Desert, going to Morocco or Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and then that gold is sort of entering into the world trades trade networks that exist in the medieval and early modern period. This is actually a source of an awful lot of the gold that's available in Europe and in the Mediterranean world. It's originally African gold, which was being traded along these caravan routes. So the gold trade, major source of wealth for these African kings. The sort of famous statement to the world, which sort of announced the significance of this, was a king named Mansa Musa. This was from the older empire of Mali back in the 1300s, who had made a pilgrimage to Mecca. He was Muslim. Um, Undertook the pilgrimage, passed through Egypt, down the Red Sea, went to the holy city of Mecca as part of his pilgrimage, and along the way is said to have given away so much gold in charity and donations and almsgiving that he actually ruined the economy of Egypt through, sudden inflation being sparked off. There's just only so much gold around that he distributed that it was enough to actually impact the economy. That gives some sense of the sort of the wealth of these African kings and the resources of gold that they had available. So gold is one thing. The Mansa Musa story also tells us something else about the area. The ruling class was Islamicized. Islam had become popular as a religion. It had never been conquered by Muslim armies. This region was not part of the great conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries. But what had happened instead was later on, over the course of the Middle Ages, as the caravan trade had picked up, you had more Muslim merchants crossing the Sahara and interacting with more southerly African kings. Um, you had these Muslim mystics called the Sufis and intellectuals crossing and interacting with people in Africa, and the rulers of these West African areas had found it beneficial, or perhaps just simply been impressed by Islam as a religion, and had chosen to adopt it. It gave them diplomatic connections, it gave them prestige, it gave them trade connections. Perhaps most importantly, it brought literacy in. With the local cultures didn't have literacy. So with the arrival of Islam, you start having a scribal class coming up who can serve the kings and bringing all the benefits that written records and the ability to write letters and correspondence and things like that bring to the kings. Um, Initially, in the early modern period, Islam did not penetrate very deep into the population. It was a matter of the royal court, some of the merchant class in the cities, but the rural population, the lower classes of a West African society, continued to pursue their own indigenous beliefs and practices rather than adopting Islam, say in the 1500s and into the 1600s. So not very deep penetration, but the sort of privilege of Islam and the way it could legitimize a king as a ruler, designated by God, kind of a divine right type of model, applied there in an Islamic vein. Um, so gold is one of the major pillars of royal power in Western Africa. Islam is going to be a second one, particularly with the benefit of literacy. And the third one, on a very practical level, is their ability to command and lead a class of mounted warriors, right? A horseback riding mounted warrior class, giving them the military force that they need to be able to dominate the area and conquer large areas and hold together a empire over against their rivals, right? Depends, of course, on the profits of the gold trade, all the luxury goods coming in that they can dispense as gifts to enable them to then reward their followers, right? But these three things together are sort of the ingredients that make up the West African grassland kingdoms, like Songhai, like Kanem Bornu. Uh, Mounted warrior class serving the kings, Islam providing literacy and a kind of a ideological underpinning for a royal power, and control of the gold trade being absolutely essential for them in that respect. Okay, I forget if it's necessary for us to talk about slavery in this context, but just in case you weren't around when we covered it, I will go ahead and talk about it. Slavery. I need to think about slavery as the Portuguese. I think we probably were on for exploration, right? The Portuguese had been moving down the coast of Africa, leading to Vasco da Gama getting to India, Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas, also coming off this process of Portuguese exploration down the Atlantic Ocean, down the coast of Africa, and eventually around to India. Um, this brings with it the rise in the slave trade, which is something we need to think about both from a European and from an African perspective. Um, From a European perspective, slavery had been widespread back in the days of the ancient Greeks and Romans. It had never officially been abolished, but it had kind of faded out for a number of reasons. I won't go into all the details in a catch-up lecture like this. Um, Basically, there were some economic shifts in the ways that Roman slave owners had managed their slaves, where they'd started getting sort of settled on patches of land of their own more, rather than being in, sort of labor gangs with overseers. And also there were some religious shifts that, with the rise of Christianity, that led to slaves being treated more like human beings, being seen as human beings with souls was more important, and also which tended to discourage enslaving one's fellow Christians, so that as Europe had become progressively more Christian, the supply of potential slaves had dried up. So slavery had practically disappeared in medieval Europe, and the descendants of the old Roman slaves had morphed into medieval serfs that we talked about way back at the beginning of the semester. People who were not free, they were under heavy obligations to masters, they were legally bound to the land that they lived on, couldn't work elsewhere or move elsewhere without their master's permission. Um, but who were not just raw human property either. They were sort of, had some sense of their place in society and their legal rights and dignity and so forth. They weren't property in the sense that a horse or a cow or a wheelbarrow was a piece of property. So a serf was under your control, under your rule as a lord. Owed you heavy obligations, was not a free person by any means, but wasn't merely property either. Um, as the Portuguese had started to come into contact with Africa, they start finding a new population of people who are not Christians and are therefore eligible for enslavement, right? Come through the kind of loophole. You're not necessarily being prohibited from enslaving them. And so there started being more of an interest in picking up people for a slave trade. Um, and the Portuguese were also occupying islands off the coast of Africa, places like the Canary Islands and the Azores, places like that. And they are introducing a system of agriculture that Italians, who were working with the Portuguese, had already started using in the Mediterranean in places like Crete and Corfu and Mediterranean islands like that, which is the plantation system. Um, the idea to a plantation system is that rather than having peasant farmers who are producing largely for their own survival, right? They're producing various goods, food to eat that they're growing in their crops, wool from sheep to make clothing out of, cutting trees to be able to make their houses and tools and things with. Peasant agriculture had been kind of self-sufficient, basically, providing all their own needs, and lords had kind of skimmed off the extra, in taxes and various things they would take from the peasants. The plantation is different from that. Rather than peasant agriculture in that sense, the plantation is aimed at the market, right? The idea is you produce a cash crop, you set up a farm which is designed not to produce all the necessities of life for people and you're just going to skim off the excess that gets produced, but you're going to start growing stuff for the market, make money on it, and the farming is going to be more market oriented, more profit oriented. And therefore, in order to maximize your profits, you're going to bring slave labor in because over the life of a slave, they're overall cheaper as a form of labor than free labor would be. Um, so the Italians in the Mediterranean had started setting up these plantations. Sugar was a major product they were starting to grow in these plantations. Indigo for dyeing cloth, a few other goods like that. They're sort of starting to produce in this way. And it sort of became a way of the classic, if you conquer an island and you have this self-contained environment, perfect setting to set up a plantation, especially in a warm, wet climate for some of these goods. Set up plantations, bring slaves in, start working, and that's how you make that island profitable for yourself. Um, the Portuguese are doing the same thing in the Canaries and the Azores, and they start looking around for slaves, and lo and behold, they have the African population handy, so they start buying slaves from the Africans and putting them to work in these plantations. The big transformation happens as a result of Spanish conquests in the Americas and also the tendency of many different European powers, excuse me, to all start seizing lands, especially in the Caribbean. A lot of Caribbean islands like Cuba, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, all these places. Also, Portuguese colonized Brazil, and of course, the English in North America are also going to start doing this. Because what happens is in those areas also, the European conquerors and colonizers try to make the land profitable. One of the things they'll start doing is introducing a plantation system. They'll initially enslave Native Americans and put the natives to work in the plantations, again, growing sugar or indigo or any of these other kinds of products. But the problem is that, as we've said beforehand, owing to European diseases as well as European violence, the native population suffers a terrible Holocaust, just, dies at extraordinary rates out of vulnerability to American diseases, to European diseases like smallpox, 80, 90% fatality rates. It's absolutely, incredible rate of fatality going on. And therefore, in order to keep the plantations going and profitable, they need to find new labor. And what they start doing is start bringing in African slaves, right? That's why the population of so many Caribbean nations today is of African descent, Cubans, Jamaicans, Haitians, and so forth. They are the descendants of, they're not the descendants of Native American islanders from those areas. They're the descendants of African slaves brought over to replace the dying off native population. So this creates an enormous demand for slavery, and as a result, an Atlantic slave trade pops up, operating on what starts becoming a very large scale as you get in the 1600s and 1700s, with thousands of slaves being brought over every year. Varying estimates, but probably getting into getting towards the millions. Once you're talking about a couple of centuries worth of slave trading on the Atlantic Ocean, you wind up with what's called a triangle trade going on, where you will bring down European goods, very often weapons, guns and steel weapons and so forth, to trade to the African peoples along the coastline there, in exchange for which they will give you slaves. We'll talk about why you're trading weapons for slaves in just a moment. You take the slaves to the Caribbean, put them to work on the plantations. The plantations grow molasses, sugar, rum, indigo, these various things, and then that those Caribbean products, the plantation products, go back to Europe into the coffee houses and the textile industry and things like that. There, so sort of triangle trade, weapons, slaves, and plantation goods operate all the way around there. Okay, so that's sort of on the European side of things. What's going on the African side of things? How is Africa interacting with all this or relating to all this? Slavery already existed in African society. It was slightly different than the way slavery operated in European society or for Westerners. In Africa, the way they conceptualized what you owned was not so much the person. It wasn't that the person became your property, but rather you acquired the right to the person's labor. Okay, you own their labor, and whatever labor they do, they have to do for you. It's a subtle distinction. It does wind up having an impact on the way the slaves are treated, and sort of the sense of humanity or lack thereof that a slave might have, right? In African society, the slave is still a person and a member of society. They're just a person whose labor is entirely owned by a king or a person to whom the king has granted it. It is transferable. Initially, slaves' labor belongs to the king, but the king can make a gift or can sell the labor of his slaves to others, and then, of course, the slave would have to go with them. So that's how African kings are empowered to go and sell slaves to Europeans. And normally, slavery is a result in Africa of having been captured in war, right? When African peoples went to war with one another, part of the standard looting and pillaging, much as was the case in other world societies back in the ancient times, you plundered and pillaged people as well as goods and wealth and other things. You took some of them captive and brought them home and made them slaves. That was pretty standard in African society. That explains why a lot of what the Europeans are trading to the Africans is going to be weapons. The Europeans are mostly not going to Africa and then roaming the African countryside and grabbing people themselves to take back to their ships and sell into slavery. Normally they're sailing into town, negotiating with local merchants, negotiating with the local king, especially, and buying up slaves that the Africans themselves have. And they're trading weapons for the slaves precisely in order to enable the people that they're trading with to go and get more slaves, right? They're sort of feeding the slave trade. If you give us slaves, we'll give you weapons. That'll make you more powerful and stronger. you'll be able to have more success against your enemies, which means you get more slaves, and this whole thing will become a great snowballing cycle. Um, One of the effects of all this is that on both sides there are multiple players. You have multiple African kingdoms, you have multiple European trading powers, the Dutch, the English, the Portuguese, and so forth. Um, and that dimensional character of the scene winds up causing it to snowball even more, or at least makes it difficult even to conceive of opting out of it, right? If Europeans come into port and say they want you to go to war against your neighbors and get some slaves for them, and you refuse to do so, what are those Europeans going to do? Well, they're going to sail up to the coast to your neighbors and trade with your neighbors to make war against you and take your people's slaves, right? So from an African perspective, um, this is both an opportunity to enrich yourself, and frankly, a lot of Africans don't have, moral scruples about this, although you do have some sources that indicate some anxiety about the effect of what's going on. Um, but it's not even really conceivable that you would refuse to deal with them, because if you did, that's going to turn you into a victim of the slave trade rather than a perpetrator of it. And nobody wants to be a victim. So the African kings can't really, they're sort of caught in a cycle that's very difficult to stop. And from the European side, there's a certain sense of, well, if we were not there trading slaves, then the French would be doing it or the Dutch would be doing it. So why should we pull out and let our rivals get all the money off of this? Right. So there's this sort of competitive dimension which just feeds it more and more and makes it happen on a larger and larger scale. So what's the effect of all this? It's controversial whether the slave trade itself had a significant demographic impact on Africa. Were the numbers of slaves taken large enough to really hinder population growth in Africa? Um, that's been argued both ways. It depends a lot on what you make of the numbers, how many people you think died in addition to the numbers that actually made it on the ships to the Caribbean. We can sort of count people on ships, but how many other people might have died while still in Africa before getting to the ships or in the course of the wars, which wound up with some people getting um, captured, right? That's kind of a bit of guesswork, so it's hard to say. And also depends on your estimates of what the African population was before the slave trade, which can be very difficult to estimate. So there are some scholars who think that this amounted to depleting the population of Africa, actually, wound up in a very destructive process that actually undermined African population growth. Other people say no, probably the population was large enough and growth was vigorous enough that skimming off of some of the population of the slave trade probably didn't really have a significant demographic impact. That's debated. It certainly is the case that it created a cycle of almost continuous warfare among the African societies, being constantly in conflict with one another. Um, Inhibited any possibility really of other kinds of economic development, right? All their energy and investment was in renewing warfare in order to get more and more slaves, so you didn't see other kinds of sectors of the economy developing in Africa. It's a huge what if whether it would have otherwise or what would have happened, but certainly it didn't, and the slave trade didn't help in those respects. It did mean that in that coastal area, which, like I said, at the beginning of the early modern period, was generally small scale segmentary societies under very, very local kings. Over the course of the early modern period, as you get in the 1600s and especially the 1700s, you start seeing some of these peoples get better at the warfare, get better at the slave trading than their neighbors are, and therefore growing at their neighbors' expense. And you see some relatively large scale, powerful kingdoms forming on the coast of Africa. Probably the poster child for that development would be a group called the Ashanti. They're right at the corner. Sort of just north of the Congo, where the western coast of Africa takes a sudden corner and turns southwards. It goes from running east-west to running north-south. Right at that corner, about where, what is it, Niger is about there today. That area was the Ashanti territory. And the Ashanti become very, very powerful, very, very wealthy off the slave trade. They're really dealing with the Europeans as trading partners on pretty much an equal basis. So you have a very powerful, centralized, militarized society. But fueled entirely by the slave trade. This is the lifeline, this is the source of their wealth and their power. So the coastal kingdoms that used to be sort of small and local and segmentary start getting larger and more hierarchical. The kings start adopting Islam like the great inland empires do. And so the slave trade has major, major implications for what's going on there. Um, Okay, the slave trade doesn't really impact the interior of Africa all that much. Places like Songhai and Kanem Bornu are not all that much affected. There is a completely different development, which is, however, going to affect it very significantly, which is in 1591, a rather extraordinary military venture. The Sultan of Morocco decided, or on the north side, facing the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, on the north side of the Sahara Desert, decides he wants to try to seize control of the caravan gold trade across the Sahara Desert. And so he organizes an army and successfully gets it across the Sahara Desert, which, if you think about it, in 16th century technology is an astonishing military feat. But gets an army across, attacks Timbuktu, destroys it, and you wind up with this attempt to build a greater Moroccan empire spanning the Sahara Desert, controlling the Niger goldfields, um, winds up destroying the empire of Songhai, undermines Kanem Bornu, which also collapses, and you end up with this anarchy breaking out because the Moroccans are able to conquer this area and defeat the existing rulers in the area. Excuse me. But the logistics prove to be too great. The distance is too far. It's too hard to maintain control. One commonly recurring pattern one sees in history is that sometimes it's relatively easy to conquer somebody, but much, much, much more difficult to actually govern someplace once you've conquered it. Um, and the Moroccans learned this in the course of the 1590s and early 1600s. They conquer Timbuktu, they conquer Songhai, but they're unable to hold on to it, and eventually have to withdraw. And when they leave behind, what they leave behind is basically anarchy. Western Africa, inland Western Africa, no longer has central, powerful ruling families to dominate it. Instead, what you have is a lot, dozens of local warlords, each trying to make themselves the guy that's going to rise to the top and become the new equivalent to a king of Songhai or a king of Kanem Bornu. None of them ever really make it, but you wind up with these sort of many little mini kingdoms, each imitating the same model. So attempting to control the gold trade, building retinues of mounted warriors around themselves, adopting Islam. The 1600s and 1700s actually see a noticeable increase in the Islamicization of Western Africa as you get more and more local peoples trying to adopt Islam, and it kind of starts filtering down the social scale, and becomes much more the predominant religion of the area rather than just a religion of a ruling elite. Okay, so that's Africa so far. That's a good point. I'll just keep going to talk about the Ottoman Empire because I know that's another area we need to cover on this. So we'll set Africa aside. You can always ask me questions later on if you want more detail in these areas, and if I know it and am able to fill it in, I will. This is all well off my own field of scholarly specialization as a medievalist. But anyway, the Ottoman Empire, major world power in the Islamic world. We're going to shift into sort of the Islamic area. I know you've got some detail about the Mughals in India, so that's good. The Ottoman Empire is really the largest, most powerful, most enduring of the Islamic empires of the early modern period. The ruling family are Turks. Turks had originated as nomads living in Central Asia, but way back in the Middle Ages, they had started filtering into the Muslim world, fighting with Arabs, conquering, migrating, taking up service as mercenaries in some cases, and you wound up with a pretty wide swath of the Middle East, seeing a lot of Turkish occupation or Turkish settlement going on in it. The area of modern Turkey, or Asia Minor, had been part of the old Byzantine Empire or East Roman Empire, and the Turks, because they'd sort of started working as military warlords and mercenaries fighting for other Muslim powers, had kind of started settling into that area as a sort of borderland between the Muslim world and the Byzantines. As the Byzantine Empire started falling on harder times over the course of the Middle Ages, the Turks had expanded at their expense. The Ottomans were one such group of Turks. There was a Turkish warlord named Osman who sort of controlled a city and a fortress and some of the surrounding countryside in the center of Asia Minor. Built a pretty successful military machine, got a reputation for success, started gathering more and more Turkish warriors around him, started expanding from that until eventually he dominated most of Asia Minor. That's how Asia Minor turns into Turkey, the land of the Turks. It's not their original homeland. They came from Central Asia, more like where Turkmenistan is more, the Turkish heartland in Central Asia. But, Asia Minor starts becoming Turkey as the Ottoman Turks are taking over more and more of it. Um, and by the end of the 1300s, he crosses into Europe. In 1451, I'm sorry, 1453, not 1451, 1453, conquers Constantinople itself, the Byzantine capital, destroys the last remains of the Byzantine Empire, and Constantinople becomes the new capital of an Ottoman Empire, right? The Ottomans Turks are now the Ottomans, getting that name from him. And from there, they expand further up into Europe. They launch conquests against other Muslims in the Middle East and wind up building an empire that's going to stretch across most of the Balkan Peninsula. They get as far as Austria. They attack Vienna a couple of times, but never conquer it. So that's about the limit of their power in Europe. But then all the way across the Middle East down to Europe, and even the lords of the Maghreb, Algeria and Morocco, are swearing allegiance to the Ottoman sultans at one point and ruling out towards Iraq as well. So huge, huge, huge empire that encompasses a large, large, large part of the Middle East and Northern Africa and the Balkans and Europe. A few things about the Ottomans, Ottoman society. One is Ottoman rule. The ruler is called a sultan. He is very much thought of as an absolute monarch with complete power. Um, there's a cultural sensibility in the Ottoman Empire that the authority of the sultan is best cultivated by not overexposing him. He should sort of be hidden from the view of the public, and that will help to cultivate a sense of awe and mystery and respect for him. If he's sort of out, being seen by the people on the regular basis, that will make him too familiar, and familiarity will breed contempt. So the Ottoman Sultan himself was sort of very rarely seen in public, very rarely exerted public roles. When he did, it was with great fanfare and ceremony to impress people. Um, Nevertheless, did have control over government. The Ottomans had a bit of a unique take on inheritance, which probably was one of the secrets of their military success, and their ability to build such a huge empire. Um, the sensibility was that the title of Sultan belonged to the family of Osman, but did not necessarily always have to go from father to son. Okay, there was in most monarchies there's an assumption that normally the eldest son of the prior monarch is going to inherit, right? That's the normal thing you would expect. But that was not at all assumed among the Ottomans. The Ottomans felt that when the old sultan died, it ought to be the most capable adult male in the family who would take over as the next sultan. That might be the old sultan's son, but it might be a brother, it might be a cousin, it might be an uncle. Any number of male members of the family were eligible to become the next sultan when the old sultan died. One of the things that meant is that Ottoman politics, succession politics, could be quite bloody. There were all kinds of intrigues and assassinations and people being arrested and executed, kind of in order to purge the bloodline and make sure there weren't too many competitors for the throne. Which certainly sounds like it might have a destabilizing effect, but it seems like, at least in the early centuries, the more significant result of this was that you always had a competent head of state. Right, the guy who wound up ruling the empire and becoming the new sultan was always somebody who was in a position to act ruthlessly, seize power, and actually run things. In many monarchies, you'll have situations where the inheritance passes from father to son, but the son might not be very smart, or the son might be incompetent, or the son might be underage and not really old enough to take charge of things and make decisions on his own. So many monarchies will have these periods of weakness from time to time when you get a weak heir taking the throne. The Ottomans really managed to avoid that. You sort of had a succession of quite strong, mature rulers taking the throne, often very ruthless individuals, obviously because of what they had to do to be able to seize power within the family. But as far as the ability to have a stable empire and a growing, conquering empire, the system actually helped that way. Since the Sultan was not seen in public all that often, the actual business of government was handled by a group of people called the Diwan. Okay, Diwan. The Diwan, kind of like a cabinet for a modern government, modern like the president's cabinet, where you have the Secretary of State and Defense and Treasury and so forth. The Diwan was kind of like that. The person in charge of it was the vizier, sort of the right-hand man, advisor, the wise man advising the Sultan, and he sort of directed the affairs of the Diwan. But you would have the heads of the army, the heads of the treasury, the heads of the justice system and the courts and so forth, religious leaders and others all sort of represented on the Diwan, sort of acting as a ruling council handling the day-to-day decisions. Um, And that also probably also contributed to a lot of the Ottoman Empire's strengths. In the early days, you had a pretty competent, ruling group of people who had sort of risen through the ranks. You didn't just inherit your role as a member of that council. It wasn't a hereditary nobility. You had, risen to become chosen as the director of each of these various departments, and that sort of entitled you, or, caused you to get the Sultan's attention, get yourself named to the Diwan, and led to a pretty smoothly functioning central government office that way. Okay, out in the provinces, sort of an ad hoc system ruling different provinces of the Ottoman Empire different ways. If an area was wealthy and central and key to the treasury and to Ottoman concerns, it would be ruled directly by governors sent out from Constantinople. Poorer areas, more outlying areas, more peripheral areas would be more left under self-rule by their own local elites with just sort of loose oversight from a palace official just to make sure they were staying loyal, paying their tribute and sending troops to the army, but otherwise not really trying to govern them very directly. So, what it was like to be ruled by the Ottomans could vary a lot depending on where you were and which part of the empire you lived in. Um, all the conquests in Europe, in particular, also gave the Ottomans a distinctive character among the other parts of the Islamic world. They were the only ones, well, the Mughals are somewhat different, but the Ottomans found themselves in the Balkans of Europe, ruling large populations of non-Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Roman Catholic Christians, Jews as well. There's significant population groups in those areas that were not Muslim, so they had to figure out how to handle that. Part of what they did was to take the old dhimmi system, which went back to the early Islamic conquest, and have this arrangement by which they owed an extra tax, had certain legal restrictions placed on them, but otherwise were tolerated and permitted to practice their own religion and culture. So the Ottomans continued that. They actually developed it into something more than was traditional, something called the millet system, Millet. Under the millet system, the religious minorities or subordinate groups actually became self-governing as far as their own internal affairs went. So not only were they allowed to maintain their own religion, they also maintained their own law. They maintained their own officials. If say a Greek Orthodox Christian got into a lawsuit with another Greek Orthodox Christian, it was tried under Greek law in a Greek court handled by a Greek judge. And they had their own headmen, and they had their own tax collectors, and they had their own officials really sort of handling a lot of their internal business. When they had business where they had to deal with the Turks and with the government, then they would not have all this self-governance, and they were actually kept under a pretty tight lid. But still, the millet system was this arrangement that was designed to uh, well, basically to maintain control with a minimum investment of manpower. Sort of let them do as much of the work of government on their own as you felt you could trust them to do. So the millet system was a very important feature. Um, and one other thing that went along with the millet system, excuse me again, especially for the Christian population in the Balkans, was a system called the Devshirme, Devshirme. The Devshirme system, which was I believe it's every 5 years or so, officials, mostly from the army of the Ottoman Empire, would go around the millet communities, particularly the Christian communities, um, and would take a tribute in children, mostly in boys. I don't think they collected girls the same way, although I could be mistaken about that. Collected a tribute in young boys, typically 7 or 8 years old. Excuse me, you got a primary source describing this in the reader, so take a look at that. Um, would recruit these boys as devshirme, take them to Constantinople or other Ottoman centers, where a number of things would happen. First of all, they would be converted to Islam and raised as Muslims. Weren't really given too much choice in the matter. This is sort of expected of them. Some provision, I believe, was actually made for the families. There was some effort to compensate the families. They get paid, and in some respects, it may even have been seen as an honor, but it was also deeply resented for the most part by the millet communities. But anyway, these boys would be taken and placed in Ottoman service and converted to Islam, and then there would be a number of different possible career tracks they could follow. Some of them became palace servants. Some of them, if they seemed a little bit brighter and more suited to education, would actually receive a religious training, religious education, and would wind up becoming imams and actually sort of entered the Islamic clergy and became prominent religious leaders in that respect. Others were sent into the government offices, the various bureaus of the Treasury and the law courts and so forth, in order to rise and serve under the Diwan officials, effectively. Some might even rise to become Diwan officials themselves. And then probably the largest group and the most sort of famous and significant group in some ways became Janissaries, which was a elite body of bodyguard soldiers serving the Sultan directly. Okay, the Janissaries were, again, from 7 or 8 years old, trained to fight. They were given the best training, the best weapons, the best equipment, the best of everything possible. Fueled with a real sort of esprit de corps. You are separate. You are different from everybody else. You have privileges. They had all kinds of legal privileges. Being a janissary meant not having to pay the same taxes everybody else did, and there were various laws that didn't apply to you, things like that. So very, very privileged group of people. The idea being, and you have similar things like this earlier in other parts of the Islamic world as well, something called the Mamluk, which was a slave soldier. Um, the idea being that what you wanted was a reliable military force that wouldn't attempt to launch a coup or a rebellion because they were detached from any of the traditional loyalties of family or region or anything like that soldiers typically had. Right, the Muslim world, its empires often had trouble with soldiers rising up in rebellion in support of their local ruler, their local families, their local clans and tribes, and what have you. Um, so the Janissary idea was to create sort of a core of the army and a bodyguard around the emperor who didn't owe loyalty to anybody but the emperor, the sultan, rather. Their entire place in life was because of their being the sultan's men, and therefore they would be politically reliable. Um, got to be quite large body of people. In uh, Turkish armies, you will see Janissaries kind of forming the core of the army in many ways, with other groups, lesser troops attached to them around the wings. And the Janissaries might get to be 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 men, in an army of 60 or 80 or 100,000 people. So, very, very large body of guys, not just a little company of 100 or 300 men or something. There's, thousands of Janissaries in the empire. Okay, so those are some of the distinctive features of the Ottoman Empire, following up on a basic overview of what's happening in early modern Africa. After you've had a chance to watch this, shoot me an email if you have any further questions. We could set up a office meeting to go over any details or see what else you need filled in. Thank you.